again. My name is Débora Rotter. I'm part of this project. It's a postdoc from University of São Paulo, Brazil. We are going to the last talk session, and it's a pleasure to introduce you, Daniel Montoya, our first speaker of this session. And Daniel is a biologist working in the Center for Biodiversity Theory and Modeling in France. He is using a combination of theory, fieldwork, experiments, and large data sets to investigate ecological questions. His ultimate goal is to apply the theory of the effects of global change on communities and ecosystems to inform conservation and restoration efforts. Daniel's career is quite inspiring, certainly relevant, and it's very interesting how he explores alternative roads for sustainable and resilient food systems. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Daniel, here at our event, and now the speech is yours.
Okay, well, thanks very much for such a nice presentation. Thanks again for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers for the invitation. You know, Darren, Mariano, Paulo. Thanks for putting together all this event. It's having a lot of fun, despite it's been a very long day. But I'm enjoying this event. So yes, as Deborah said, I try to combine different approaches to address different ecology questions. One of the topics that I'm interested in is in designing sustainable agriculture. And to do this, so far I've been using mostly models. So I'm not going to show any empirical work this time, but it's okay. So I'm going to talk about managing intensive agriculture for multiple ecosystem services and stakeholders. And first of all, I would like to thank the Center for Biodiversity Theory and Modeling, the CNRS in France, the Agronomic Research Institute, the Agri Skills program from the European Union for funding, and different people I've worked with over the past years in this project, which has officially finished, but we're still getting some results from it. Okay, so the question is, how can we manage agriculture for multiple ecosystem services and stakeholders? To set the context a little bit, even though Darren set the context in the first talk, the human population is growing. The growth rates, they have decreased a little bit, but they are still positive. So this means that there's more population in the world. There will be more population, and all this population will have to eat. Traditionally or historically, what humans have done is to intensify agricultural systems by converting natural land into crops, using mechanization methods, chemical inputs like fertilizers and herbicides, pesticides, etc. And this has worked for a lot of time. However, what we are realizing over the last decade mainly is that the production of many major crops worldwide is not increasing anymore. In some cases, their production has saturated, but it's even decreasing in some parts of the world. So, well, at first this shouldn't be a problem, because the solution is, we know the historical solution is to intensify agriculture. So let's convert more natural land into crops, let's use more chemical inputs, etc. The thing is, there's not, in some places of the world, there's not more land to convert, or there's protection laws that don't allow more land to be converted into any type of agricultural system. So, and actually there's also some data suggesting that even adding more chemical inputs is not going to increase yields of some crops around the world. So within this context, this question makes much more sense. So how can we manage agriculture for multiple services and stakeholder demands. To address these questions, we decided to focus on 4 important elements in agricultural ecosystems. Of course, there's more important elements, but we decided to work on these 4 ones. The first, I'm going to briefly introduce each of those. The first one is the trade-offs in ecosystem service provision. So we know that all ecosystems around the world, including agricultural systems, they provide multiple ecosystem functions and ecosystem services, and this has been reported repeatedly in the scientific literature, both by empirical studies and also theoretical studies that capture those trade-offs. So if we want to manage agricultural systems for multiple services, we need to consider the existence of these trade-offs. A second important element is the presence of multiple stakeholders. So, the demand for ecosystem services is the other side of the coin in the ecosystem service metaphor. On one hand, we have the ecosystem service supply, and the other one, on the other hand, we have the demand for those ecosystem services. And in this figure, there's a representation of several of the potential stakeholders that exist in agricultural and food systems. So we need to consider this, because probably the demand of these stakeholders is going to reflect the trade-offs in the ecosystem service supply as well. So a third important element is global change. We know there's a lot of data and empirical projections that have been supported by, theoretical projections supported by data. Basically showing us that the mean values of several environmental variables are increasing, like for example temperature in this figure. But it's not only the mean values which is changing, it's also the variability of these values around the mean. And in the last years, there's been an increasing more research on understanding the effects of this changing variability in environmental variables on the provision of ecosystem services, including crop production. So this is an element that we must also acknowledge and analyze when addressing the original question. And finally, the fourth element we wanted to consider is the existence of a diversity of food production systems. There's not a single way of producing food in the world. There's many classifications that we can establish. Here I'm just using 2 of them, which are very relevant. One is based on the intensity of the agricultural production, and here we could separate 2 big groups of agricultural production. The one that is intensively managed through the use of chemicals, conversion of a lot of natural land into crops, etc. And a second group will be represented by wildlife-friendly practices, organic farming, and this type of agricultural practices. And a second classification is based on crop types. And in this regard, there's a classification of crops depending on the degree to which they depend on wild animal pollination. This was done by running pollinator exclusion experiments. And now we have a lot of information about different crops and how much they depend on wild animal pollination, from no dependence at all to almost total pollination. So these are the 4 elements that we wanted to address to take into account to address the original question. And but of course, there's a lot of potential scenarios that we could study here. So we decided to start with a simple case study of crop production in intensive farming systems. So we're talking about intensively managed systems, and one of the characteristics of these type of systems is that most of the biodiversity exists in the remaining fragments of natural habitat. So cropland doesn't host important levels of biodiversity. And these type of systems can be broadly defined by 2 types of habitat patches. On one hand, we have cropland used to grow crops, and the The second type of patch is in natural, semi-natural habitat, which, as I said, hosts most of the biodiversity. In this case, or as an example, it could be the diversity of pollinators that move around the landscape to pollinate both crops and wild plants. So the idea was to look at a particular set of ecosystem services. As I said, this is a model, it's a simplification of reality, and we only consider 3 ecosystem services, namely the crop production at a landscape scale, the crop production per unit area or yield per area, and biodiversity, which, I mean, it is debated whether biodiversity is an ecosystem service in itself or not. I'm not going to go into detail about that debate, but here we consider it as an ecosystem service. And we look at the trade-offs between these 3 ecosystem services and landscape composition, quantified as the fraction of semi-natural habitat relative to cropland. So then we consider 3 stakeholder demands, which are associated with each of these ecosystem services. Agricultural unions or cooperatives are mostly interested in maximizing landscape crop production. Farmers are more interested in maximizing yield per area. And conservationists or wildlife organizations are interested in protecting at least a minimum level of biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. And then we included global change by adding environmental stochasticity and changing these parameters associated with environmental stochasticity, and look at a variety of crop types based on the degree to which they depend on crop pollination dependence. And the output of this work was to determine what are the best landscape compositions, or the best fraction of semi-natural habitat in the agricultural landscape that can maximize either of the 3 ecosystem services or the stakeholder demands. So the whole idea was to look at what happens if we prioritize one stakeholder demands over the others, and what would happen, or what should we do in case we want to get or obtain or achieve a multifunctional system. Okay, so we base this in a model of crop yield dynamics, which I'm not going to go into detail in the model, but this model was used to quantify these 3 ecosystem services that I was talking about, and it was able to reproduce trade-offs that have been observed by empirical studies, and these trade-offs manifest not only in the mean values of the ecosystem services, but also in their stability or in their variability through time. So essentially, I mean, I don't want these slides to be very complicated. They're much more simple than they seem at first sight. So we tried different methods to address this question. We used viability analysis, which is used in economics. We used multifunctionality approaches from ecology, but finally we ended up using the most simple approach, which was basically just simulating, running simulations, and look at what happens when you maximize one service over the others. So essentially, we can take one of the services, like landscape production here, we simulate that service over time, and then we can plot here in plot B these ecosystem services as a function of the fraction of semi-natural habitat, showing this ham-shaped relationship that is also observed in empirical studies. So essentially, these numbers here, these percentages, they refer to what we call the function threshold, or the amount that of that ecosystem's, I mean, the fraction of the maximum of that ecosystem services that you can get within a established range of semi-natural habitat. Then we can play with different variables, like looking at the fraction of semi-natural habitat as a function of crop pollination dependence. Of course, this relation is positive because pollinators live in semi-natural habitat. And then the whole idea, the most important thing, is that we focus on one of these services. In this example, landscape crop production, we look at within which range of semi-natural habitat can we get at least a 95% of the maximum value of that service according to the simulations. And then we look at what is the provision of the other services within that range. So we can do this for either 3 of the services. And finally, we were also interested in looking at a kind of social average scenario where we target multifunctional landscape. And we did this by applying a maximum approach, which essentially maximizes the provision of the least provisioning service. So I hope it's not too complicated. So one of the outputs of this is here, in this case, we have a crop that, whose production depends, 50% of its production depends on wild animals. And here in the y-axis, we have the percentage of the function threshold, so how much of the maximum provision of a given service, as a function of the stakeholder that is prioritized. So, for example, if we prioritize agricultural unions, this is at least maximum 95% maximum of its value, which corresponds to a different provision of the other services. So I'm not going to go into much detail into the figures, into the trade-offs, the compatibilities, etc. But what it's interesting is that, of course, prioritizing one stakeholder has effects on the other ones. There are some scenarios where compatibilities exist between stakeholders and ecosystem services. Some of the cases where this reconciliation or compatibility is almost impossible. And here this is a social average scenario, which achieves a high value, high percentage of all the services. And then we did this for different crop types, and we saw that effectively the degree to which crops depend on animal pollination change these function thresholds and change the results. So it's an element, a factor that should be considered in management policies. So of course, if you are less strict as a stakeholder on the amount or the maximum amount of your service or the services that you are targeting, you're less strict, then compatibility is more likely among all services. And finally, this is again a pollinator dependence of 50%. Here we have the best landscape composition that maximizes or gets this 95% of more or a given ecosystem service, and how it changes as a function of stochasticity. So there's a take-home message here is that the biggest changes happen when the stochasticity is high, which is the prediction by global change models. And here the compatibility among different ecosystem services is lower when stochasticity is higher. Of course, these results are also affected by the degree to which crops depend on pollination. And just as an example, we were interested in looking at whether there's policies around the world targeting specific amounts of fractions of semi-natural habitat within agricultural landscapes. We found the European Union Green Policy, the Haiti biodiversity targets, and the Brazilian Forest Code, which is very convenient for this event. And in most of the cases, we observe that it's only landscape crop production that can be achieved with these policies. Social average scenarios, they are far above these lines, these dashed lines, and the other services, the services biodiversity and yield per area, they are really far above the these management policies that exist. So just to conclude, agricultural management, so we consider multiple social and ecological factors and their interactions. The best landscape compositions differ among the functions or the ecosystem services that you target or the stakeholders that you prioritize, and are determined by different factors such as crop type, environmental stochasticity, and the amount of an ecosystem services that stakeholders are willing to accept, which is what we call function thresholds. And interestingly, these so-called social average scenarios may be a good option for multifunctional landscapes, as they can achieve relatively high values of all ecosystem services, at least in our model. These results are relevant under the current scenario of pollination agriculture. As you may know, pollination agriculture worldwide is shifting towards more pollinator-dependent crops, and in the global change scenario where the frequency of extreme climatic events is increasing. So just finally, and I end with this, this is a simple model. It's a simplification of reality. It could be, we could add much more realism by including more ecosystem services, more stakeholders, including the effects of fragmentation of semi-natural habitat, not only landscape composition on the provision of ecosystem services. We could use different food production systems, like organic farming. We could look at the stabilizing role of biodiversity, which would have effects, especially on the scenario of increasing environmental stochasticity. We could look at different output or performance metrics, not just best landscape compositions. For example, we could look at, what is the optimal amount of chemical input or things like that. So it's a very simple model, or relatively simple model. But the important thing is that it highlights different factors that are usually not included in management policies, and that our model suggests that change or should be considered in these policies. So with this, I finish, and I thanks again very much everyone for listening and the organizer of this event. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for your talk. And now let's go to the questions.
Brilliant. So I've got a couple of questions up here for you, Daniel. So the first is, how do you think social averages have changed through time, and how do you think they will change in the future?
How social averages will change through time? Well, that's a very complex question. I don't know how to answer. It depends on so many things. I mean, it depends according to the model that we develop. I mean, it depends on landscape composition. It depends on stakeholder preferences. It depends on which ones and how many ecosystem services and stakeholders you consider. It depends on stochasticity. So it's really difficult to predict. Definitely. I don't have a clear answer right now.
No, well, that's absolutely fine, no problem. That is a very difficult question, so apologies for putting you on the spot there.
That's fine.
We've got a second question. It says, how are spatial aspects considered in your model? Some ecosystem services might be more local than others, as might some stakeholder demands. Have you got a sense?
Yes. So this model is spatially implicit. So essentially, it means that so the patches of semi-natural habitat, they host all pollinator biodiversity, and all these pollinators, they can reach every single crop in the simulated landscape. So there is no like distance decay, in the pollinator flow, etc. So in that way, it's not it's not spatially explicit. We don't assume there's we ignore local effects or local preferences of certain stakeholders over others. And we are right now we are working in it's in a very advanced stage. We are working on a more spatial explicit version of these results, including fragmentation, including pollinators that can't reach very far, including the effects of fragmentation on biodiversity, the stabilizing role of pollinators, etc. So, so yeah, that's more results to come in that area. But this one is spatial implicit. Yeah.
Brilliant. That's great. I have a question myself, actually, if that's all right. I thought it was really interesting that you started talking about the global policies and how essentially they were only suitable for maximising production. Obviously, correct me if I'm wrong there. But I was just interested in, obviously, how would you, or based on your model, have you got any sense of how you would craft a new policy in order to generate the sort of maximum provision of multiple ecosystem services?
Yeah, well, not just, I mean, there's like a sort of recent convergence of a number. There's a, you know, on the fraction of wild or natural, semi-natural habitat that you should keep within what it's called working landscapes. So with our theoretical model, there's a lot of times where this 20% of semi-natural habitat, you know, within an agricultural landscape, of course, making the assumptions we make in our model, like in any other model. So we have this 20% number. There's a recent paper which also found this 20% number. It doesn't mean that it's a golden rule, of course, because it depends on what ecosystem services you are targeting. It depends on many things. Actually, in this very simple model, we get the best option would be around, you know, around more than 30% or even 40% of semi-natural habitat at intermediate stochasticity. So, you know, it depends a lot. But what is sure is that this number, in general, there's convergence that should be higher than the one that is usually targeted by management policies. Even the most ambitious one, that target, I think it's around 17% of you know, wild natural habitat.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so more semi-natural habitat essentially would be beneficial. So targeting more semi-natural habitat. That's great. Thank you.